Committee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on women and girls in the criminal justice system, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I am very pleased that the subcommittee is holding this hearing today. After decades of policies that led to mass incarceration, we are finally at a point of examining the policies and the consequences. What has been missing from the discussion of criminal justice reform is the special and specific impact the tough on crime era has had on women and children. Today's hearing begins a discussion about women in the criminal justice system. It is critical that we understand how and why women become involved in the system, what happens to them when they are incarcerated, and what their trajectory is once released. We need to examine the impact of the war on drug-related policies that specifically targeted women in hopes of capturing men. What happens to families and especially children when women are incarcerated? We need to examine the special needs women have when they are incarcerated. What's different? What are their needs? What happens to their children while they're in the system and when they're released? For example, federal law can lead to termination of parental rights if the child of an incarcerated woman remains in foster care beyond 18 months. Some states have even shortened the timeline to 6 or 12 months. If a woman receives a sentence of 5 years, why should she face losing her children forever to adoption? Examining pregnancy while incarcerated is the most obvious difference. Specifically, prisons and jails are not designed or equipped to deal with the issues of pregnant women in custody. I'd like to recognize now Charlotte Cook. Wave your hand, please. While in prison, she complained that she was pregnant. The medical staff at the prison insisted that it was just because she was fat and stressed out. After much persistence, a blood test ruled that she was in fact pregnant, although 6 weeks into her pregnancy without prenatal care. She had complications and her son was born a preemie at 4.5 pounds. 18 months later, he was diagnosed with severe autism. But the health needs of women, regardless of pregnancy, is different, and all women should have access to appropriate medical care. That includes access to gynecological care and not just during the childbearing years. So what is to be done? Through this hearing, we will learn the common reasons why women enter the criminal justice system. This testimony must inform our next steps on sentencing reform. The testimony of Ms. Kerman and Ms. Shank will help us determine whether it is time to revisit our overly broad drug conspiracy laws, which tend to leave low-level offenders, commonly women, laden with the responsibility for actions they did not commit or sometimes didn't even know about. We must also consider methods of reviewing extremely long sentences, as the number of women serving life sentence is on the rise. 1 out of every 15 women in prison, nearly 7,000, is serving a life or virtual life sentence. While 80% of women in the criminal justice system are mothers, these life sentences do not only affect the person incarcerated, they affect the children who lose a parent. Thus, the conversation of incarcerated women must include a conversation about their children. The Urban Institute's research shows that staying in touch promotes positive outcomes for both the children and their parents, which often reduces recidivism. Communities must also be a part of the conversation. Teachers and staff should prioritize knowledge and sensitivity about issues children of an incarcerated parent face. Schools should spearhead efforts to meet the needs of children with incarcerated loved ones and offer resources or clubs targeted towards students who have been affected by incarceration, including support groups, counseling, extracurricular activities, providing opportunities to process experiences through poetry, writing, arts, and journaling. Perhaps if we do this, we can reduce the statistic that 50% of children who have a parent incarcerated wind up incarcerated later in life. Connections should be made with community programs and local service providers that serve families affected by incarceration for additional support. And finally, we cannot ignore the conditions of women in prison and the difficulties of their reentry back into communities after release. I hope to explore how we can improve conditions of women incarcerated to ensure that their most basic needs are met, including the needs of incarcerated pregnant women. Any facility that incarcerates women must be held to minimal standards of care. Today, women will no longer be overlooked in the criminal justice conversation. We must have an overall approach to criminal justice reform that specifically considers women. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our panel of witnesses and the opportunity to discuss these issues. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Radcliffe.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, and thanks to each of our witnesses for being here today to discuss the impact of the criminal justice system on women and girls. To do that, I think it's crucial that we take a step back to first understand the importance of the criminal justice system in the first place. Law enforcement officers, men and women of all races and all backgrounds, put their lives on the line every day all around this country in order to protect our communities. They make these extraordinary sacrifices to ensure that children are safe from exploitation by sex offenders. They do that to keep women and girls safe from domestic abusers. They make these sacrifices to defend the weak and the vulnerable among us. And importantly, they also do it to uphold the rule of law. We should all agree on these fundamental principles. As members of Congress, our role is to ensure that Lady Justice is blind and that bias has no place in our criminal justice system. As my good friend, the former chair of this subcommittee, Trey Gowdy, once said, we should strive for a criminal justice system that is not just respected by the American people, but is worthy of their respect. As a former prosecutor, my role was to be a zealous advocate for the truth. And during that time, I encountered crimes committed that were shocking to my conscience and sickening to my soul. In those cases, enhanced sentences and mandatory minimums were fair, and they were just. Crimes committed against children, the most innocent and the most vulnerable members of our society, should stick with us. They should haunt us, and then they should spur us to take action. Much of the debate here in Congress has been about criminal justice reforms and the impact of mandatory minimums and how to reduce recidivism. We should be vigilant in determining the causes of increasing female incarceration rates in this country. We should be open to addressing in a bipartisan fashion the unique needs of women and girls in our criminal justice system. As Congress has debated criminal justice reform, many states have acted as laboratories of democracy, creating innovative ways to handle their unique challenges and providing Congress with a view of what works and what doesn't work. We can and we should learn from that. And let us not forget that even some so-called nonviolent offenses, there are victims too numerous to mention and unfortunately too easy for us to ignore. Drug traffickers that profit off the importation of deadly and illicit drugs like heroin, methamphetamines, and fentanyl in our communities leave a trail of destruction in their wake. The race or gender of drug traffickers does not matter. What matters is that their victims come from all backgrounds and from all walks of life. I yield back.
It's now my pleasure to recognize the chairman of the full Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
I thank the Crime Subcommittee Chair, our colleague from California, Karen Bass, for holding this important hearing on the special issues related to women and girls in the criminal justice system. In recent years, there has been a growing consensus that our nation's criminal justice system must be substantially reformed. One critical element of this national conversation that has been largely absent, however, is consideration of the unique experiences and needs of women and girls in the system and our responsibility to develop creative ways to address those issues. It is particularly urgent that we do so because women are the fastest growing segment of our nation's incarcerated population. While recent efforts at reforming the criminal justice system are at least partly responsible for slight reductions in the rate of incarceration overall, the proportion of incarcerated women is steadily rising. This disturbing trend must be examined. In addition, we should also consider whether the reforms already instituted across the country are appropriately designed to address the issues faced by women and girls in the criminal justice system. These issues are numerous and diverse, impacting all stages of the criminal justice system. One such injustice, for example, is the so-called girlfriend problem, where a woman in a relationship is held responsible through conspiracy charges for the entirety of a criminal scheme orchestrated by her partner, often involving drug distribution, in which the woman had minimal involvement. In such cases, the woman may even receive a harsher sentence than her relationship partner, who had the real role, because the more culpable partner is able to cut a deal for a shorter sentence based on divulging information to prosecutors. The less culpable partner does not have much, if any, useful information to divulge because she doesn't know any, and thus lacks the leverage to obtain a more favorable plea agreement. Addressing this unfair situation is important because the war on drugs appears to be a large driver of the incarceration rates of women, as illustrated by the fact that the proportion of women in prison for a drug offense has increased from 12% in 1986 to 25% in more recent years. Another problem is the impact of pretrial custody on women. Over 60% of women who are incarcerated have not even been convicted of a crime, and yet they are held in pretrial custody in jail. This is particularly disturbing because many of these women are the only providers for their children. A recent survey revealed that more than 150,000 children had a parent in jail because the parent could not afford bail, not because the parent presented a particular risk to the community or risk of not appearing at trial. That means that children are impacted by pretrial detention in startling numbers. And this problem is most often caused by pretrial incarceration of sole provider mothers. Clearly, we must take steps to address this crisis of vastly overused pretrial custody. We must also focus on the unique inequities that women face while incarcerated. As a result of Subcommittee Chair Bass's leadership, Congress finally passed legislation implementing reforms at the federal level that ban shackling during pregnancy and require the provision of feminine hygiene products in federal prisons. These provisions were enacted last year in the First Step Act with bipartisan support, including the efforts of our current ranking member of the committee, Doug Collins. But much more must be done to improve the conditions for women in federal and state prisons and jails, and I hope this will also be a bipartisan priority. As this committee develops plans to further reform our criminal justice system, it is clear that our efforts must be informed by the unique issues faced by women in that system. I appreciate the chair for holding this important hearing, which will assist us in this process. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
It's now my pleasure to introduce today's panel. Ms. Jesslyn McCurdy is Deputy Director at the Washington Legislative Office of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she represents the ACLU before Congress and the executive branch. She covers various criminal justice issues, including federal sentencing, prison reform, drug policy, and capital punishment. She previously served as the lead counsel with the subcommittee on the Historic Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which lowered the 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Ms. Cindy Shank is a mother of 3 beautiful children, turned advocate for criminal justice reform following her time in prison. Ms. Shank's 15-year sentence under drug conspiracy laws was commuted by President Obama after she served 8 years in prison. Ms. Shank was featured in the HBO documentary, The Sentence. Ms. Piper Kerman, author of Orange is the New Black, which is about the 13 months Piper served at the Federal Correction Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. She is an advocate who teaches writing classes at 2 state prisons in Ohio as an affiliate instructor with Oberlin University. Ms. Alex Kazura is the legal director for the Prison Policy Initiative and has played a central role in building Prison Policy Initiative campaign against prison gerrymandering and led the organization's work on its second major issue, sentencing enhancement zones. Ms. Patrice Owuku, a senior policy analyst at Independent Women's Forum. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you will have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes has expired. Before proceeding with testimony, I hereby remind each witness that all of your written and oral statements made to the subcommittee in connection with this hearing are subject to penalties of perjury. Ms. McCurdy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. The American Civil Liberties Union would like to thank you and the Ranking Member Ratcliffe for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on women and girls in the criminal justice system. Prison is a women's issue. Lost in the sobering statistics on this country's prison population and the narrative surrounding mass incarceration is the degree to which women are ensnared in the criminal justice system. Over the past 30 years, the number of incarcerated women has grown exponentially. Again, women are the fastest growing segment of the prison population, increasing by 700% from 1980 to 2017, a rate twice that of men. Today, more than 200,000 women are incarcerated in jails and prisons across this country. The majority of women in prison are incarcerated for low-level offenses, most often property and drug-related crimes, even as the rate of incarceration for women has risen dramatically. In recent years, the percentage of women sentenced for crimes involving violence has fallen. Much of the growth in the women's prison population over the past 30 years can be attributed to the war on drugs. From 1988 to 1999, the number of women in state facilities for drug offenses grew by 888%. Drug and property offenses are often fueled by conditions of poverty, addiction, and untreated mental health issues, which is experienced by many women cycling through the criminal justice system. In addition to poverty, what often lands women in prison is their history of physical and sexual abuse, high rates of HIV, and substance abuse problems. When they participate in more serious crimes, including serious drug crimes and robbery, women are minor accomplices. When women commit homicide, they often do so in order to protect themselves from men who have abused them. Women of color are disproportionately represented in the population of incarcerated women. In 2014, Black women were more than twice, and Latino women were 20% more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Although the racial disparities among incarcerated women has narrowed over the past 15 years, the legacy of the disparity remains. Girls are more likely than boys to be in the juvenile facilities due to low-level status offenses or technical violations, and are far less likely to be detained for violent offenses. Women make up approximately 7% of the federal prison population, almost 13,000 women, compared to 1980, when there were 13,000 women in both state and federal prisons combined. More than 70% of the women sentenced in 2017 in the federal system were convicted of drug trafficking, fraud, or immigration offenses. In the same year, 68% of females sentenced had little or no prior criminal history. Furthermore, women frequently end up in federal prison due to federal drug conspiracy laws. Too often, federal drug conspiracy laws disproportionately punish those who unwittingly and unknowingly find themselves caught in the net of drug-related activity, even in a peripheral role. Women who are minimally involved in drug dealing, but who have partners or family members involved in the drug trade, can be required to serve long sentences as a result of conspiracy. Some of these relationships are abusive or coercive and leave women vulnerable and with few options. Women of color often find themselves subjected to prosecution based on their relationships and associations rather than their own personal conduct. Adding to the burden of women behind bars is that the majority of women in prison are mothers. Since 1991, the number of children with a mother in prison has grown 131%. The majority of these women are both custodial parents and primary financial providers. Further, mothers behind bars are 5 times more likely than men to report that their children are in foster care or cared for by the state. The very existence of parental relationships can be endangered when a parent is incarcerated. Incarcerated parents who have not abused or neglected their children are far likelier to lose their parental rights permanently than a non-incarcerated parent who has assaulted their child. Women are the fastest growing incarcerated population in the U.S., leaving far too many children and families without a mother. despite the fact that she is often their primary caregiver. Until we recognize the unique circumstances, needs, and consequences associated with women who come in contact with the criminal legal system, we will never truly address this nation's mass incarceration problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schenk?
Hi, thank you for allowing me to come here today and share my, Hi, thank you for allowing me to come here today and share my story. My name is Cynthia Schenk, and in 2008, I was convicted on drug conspiracy charges from a crime that happened when I was 24 years old. I met a man when I was 24 years old in 1997, and in the course of our relationship over 5 years, he grew into a drug dealer, and he became a very large drug dealer. During my relationship with him, he was very abusive to me, kept keeping me from my family, keeping me from my friends, to the extent that there was locks on all the doors, double-sided locks and bars on all the windows. And the last year that I was with him, I wasn't allowed to leave the house at all. Over the course of him being such a large drug dealer, his paranoia and control took over to the point where I had no control over anything that I could even do. He was murdered in 2002, and I was initially charged with conspiracy to his drug operation. The charges were actually dropped, and I actually moved on with my life. I, gave my life to the Lord. I started focusing on myself and bettering myself. I met a wonderful man. We got married, had 2 beautiful daughters, and I was pregnant with my 3rd daughter when I was indicted 5.5 years later on all those crimes that were committed 5-6 years prior. I then went away to prison in 2008 when my daughter Annalise was just 6 weeks old. Autumn was 4 and Ava was 2 years old. Needless to say that prison destroyed my small young family. Prison is set up to separate and destroy bonds that are there, and as a mother, you need to be there for your children. I was initially sent to Pekin, Illinois, which I was getting regular visits, and I was able to see the girls about every 6 to 8 weeks. The prison closed for women, and it was transferred to a men's RDAP, so I was sent to Coleman, Florida. So now I saw my daughters once a year at that point, and they were still so young. During my time in Florida, my husband filed for divorce, which I completely understood because he was serving the sentence too with me, and I wanted him to have a chance at a life. Sorry. I spent 8.5 years in federal prison before I was given clemency by President Obama. During my time in federal prison, though, I met many women who were just like me, who were serving long sentences for crimes related to their then husbands or boyfriends that they had little knowledge of. I had to witness and hear the cries of mothers at night who had just signed over custody of their children because they no longer could be there for them, and they were taken away from them. To hear mothers cry at night over and over again, different mothers every night for something that to have your child taken away from you forever and signed away is something that I will never forget. Or coming back from a visit and having a mother cry in my arms because her daughter said, "Mom, the person that I'm staying with has been touching me." These are the realities that when mothers leave, their children are put in places where they're not 100% protected. Nobody's going to care for your child as a mother does. So when a mother is taken away, it's the children who suffer. When I went away, I was able to put my daughters in play therapy. Autumn started play therapy when she was 4 years old, and she continues to be in therapy now. I do not know what the cost of this incarceration is going to mean for my children, but I do know that we won't see the true ramifications of this sentence that has impacted their lives for years to come. It'll impact their choices that they make every single day with their, the men that they choose to date, the paths that they choose to take. And I believe that this is long-lasting, not just for me and my family, but more importantly to my children. Many of the women also I wanted to point out that I met are very deserving of a second chance. They deserve a second chance to be able to have their own success story, and it is in your hands to make these decisions. And I encourage you to please allow them their own second chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kerman?
Ranking Member Ratcliffe and members of the committee, I appreciate you inviting me here today. In my memoir, Orange is the New Black, I recount the 13 months that I spent incarcerated in the federal prison system, with most of my time served at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. I was also incarcerated for a first-time drug offense. I'm grateful to add my voice with other returned citizens like Cindy Shank and Charlotte, who are here with us today to call for changes to the U.S. criminal justice system. Our experiences are essential to understanding the reform that's needed in the system, so that it will both provide for public safety, but in a way that is legal, humane, and sensible. And that's why I'm here today. So incarceration rates are not driven by crime rates. They are driven by policy decisions. For decades, women and girls have been the fastest growing part of the prison population in the United States. Is this because of an unprecedented crime wave perpetrated by American women? No. Rather, the 700% increase in female incarceration has been driven by government policy, bad policy decisions, like the 1994 federal crime bill, which resulted in inflated incarceration rates at both the federal and the state levels. One of the most clear-cut examples of the failed policies of mass incarceration is the increased imprisonment of women and girls and what happens to them and their families like Cindy's. There's very little public safety rationale for most women's prison sentences, which impose a very heavy cost to the American public, both socially and also economically. Almost all women in prison and jail, among all women in prison and jail, it's estimated that between 80 and 90% have themselves been victims of violence or serious trauma prior to their incarceration. Because our law enforcement system does not target or treat all Americans equally, the data shows that women of color are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, even though they are not more likely than white women to commit crimes. One of the reasons that my memoir caught the public imagination is that it is so unusual for a middle-class white woman to be policed, to be prosecuted, and to be punished with prison. And unfortunately, the same cannot be said for women of color. American prisons and jails are built by and for men, and they're governed by policies and procedures that are developed for male prisoners. In addition, American prisons and jails are punitive, and they rarely rehabilitate or restore the people we send there, almost all of whom will return to the community. I was incarcerated in a women's prison, and I now teach in a men's medium security prison, and I can assure you that there is no institution more hierarchical, dominance-oriented, patriarchal, and operating constantly on the threat and the promise of violence than an American prison. And this is not an accident, it is by design. And the failure of punitive policy is reflected in our high recidivism rates. So for most incarcerated women, regardless of their background, their prison sentence does not only punish them, and that's because most mothers in prison have kids under the age of 18. Most incarcerated mothers are also the single heads of household, and when we lock them up, the effect on their families is seismic. On all measures, from stable housing, being well-fed, to doing well in school, parental incarceration seriously harms children. So we don't have to do things this way. Before I conclude my testimony, I want to draw your attention to just two policies that could, if replicated across the country, help to fix some of the mistakes of the last 4 decades. So one is a program in New York called Justice Home. Justice Home began in 2013, and as part of the program, in cooperation with judges and prosecutors, women who are facing prison or jail for a felony are given a chance to remain at home with their families, to be held accountable in the community, and to get the help and support that they need to do better. And that is exactly what happens. 88% of Justice Home graduates remain arrest-free after they complete the program. And Justice Home also realizes massive fiscal savings. The total cost to taxpayers to incarcerate a woman in New York, if she has 2 children who go into foster care, is over $130,000 a year. it costs less than $20,000 a year to support a woman to a better future via Justice Home, and it gets much better results. Again, looking to the states for innovation, we see 2 new primary caretaker legislations adopted in Massachusetts and Tennessee. And these new measures require judges in those states to consider family impact when they are sentencing a person who is a primary caregiver of minor children, and to impose accountability measures that are appropriate for the offense that will not harm those children. And it's worth pointing out that Massachusetts and Tennessee have very different political landscapes. But everybody can see the value of this kind of reform, regardless of their political party. Primary caretaker policies should be adopted within the federal system so that federal judges are required to make the same considerations at sentencing.
Thank you.
So I look forward to today's important testimony on women and girls' pathways into prison, the harsh conditions that we must survive there, and the steps that are necessary for safe and successful return to the community. But I implore the members of this committee and all public officials to prioritize policy changes that will reduce the number of women and girls ever going into a correctional facility.
Thank you.
Because those are the changes that will make us safer. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you. Ms. Castro?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass and Ranking Member
Sure,
Ratcliffe.
is your microphone on?
It says talk. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass and Ranking Member Ratcliffe and members of the subcommittee for providing me the opportunity to share some data on women's incarceration, not only because this is an issue that's been overlooked for far too long, but also because women's experiences in the criminal justice system serve to highlight the faults of the entire system. The U.S. incarcerates women at the highest rate in the world, so there's a lot of data to dig through, but as I outline the basics, I would like you to all keep one fact in mind. 1 in 4 women who are incarcerated have not been convicted. That figure alone demonstrates that we use incarceration far too much. Since the 70s, women's state prison populations have grown faster than their male counterparts. There are nearly 10 times as many women in state prisons now as 40 years ago. And despite this dramatic growth, women's incarceration remains an afterthought. And in most states, women have not benefited from recent efforts to reduce incarceration as much as men have. There are many complex and interconnected reasons why the U.S. is incarcerating women at ever-increasing rates. And here are a couple of examples. States still continue to widen the net of criminal justice involvement by criminalizing women's responses to gender-based abuse and discrimination. We've heard about the expansion of drug conspiracy laws that lead to even minor or peripheral roles of women receiving very harsh sentences, even more harsh than those in charge of the operation. But in terms of gender abuse, you have policy changes that led to mandatory dual arrests just simply for fighting back against domestic violence. And once caught in the net, there are fewer diversion programs available to women. In Wyoming, for example, there was a boot camp that allowed men to participate in a 6-month program instead of having to serve a lengthy sentence. But no similar program is available in the state for women. So they face years of incarceration for first-time offenses, while their male counterparts can quickly return to the community. And then once women are incarcerated, they face more and harsher disciplinary sanctions for similar behavior when compared to men. And this disciplinary action harms women's ability to earn time off the sentence and decreases chances of parole. But the tentacles of mass incarceration have a long reach. Women incarcerated in jails and prisons account for just a small percentage of women under some form of correctional control. Probation accounts for the majority of women under correctional control and is often billed as an alternative to incarceration. But compliance with restrictive probation terms is particularly difficult for women. It often sets us up to fail. For example, probation comes with mandatory monthly fees, which women are in the worst position to afford, and failing to pay these fees alone is often a violation of probation. Child care duties further complicate compliance because probation requirements often include travel to mandatory meetings or having to get advance permission for an emergency school pickup or advance permission for an emergency doctor's visit. And ongoing struggles with mental health and substance abuse disorders, which affect women in jails far more than men, require additional support rather than being viewed as punishment, rather than being punished as a failure of probation. And even as incarceration rates drop, women's incarceration continues to grow. Getting hard data is the obvious next step for policy change. And you would think that knowing how many women are locked up and where and why would be easy. After all, this is a population that's literally counted multiple times a day. But there's an astounding lack of data on women's incarceration. I set out to give a complete picture of women's incarceration in my report, Women's Mass Incarceration, The Whole Pie, and I had to weave together data scattered across incompatible government reports and surveys. And for example, the last time the Bureau of Justice Statistics published a comprehensive report on incarcerated women, it was 1999. That's 20 years ago. And since then, data on incarcerated women have been available piecemeal, scattered throughout BJS publications. But even worse, the BJS has stopped even collecting some data on women's incarcerated, much less publishing it. When our statistical agencies are blindfolded, the policymakers are too. And having accurate and timely data is an important part of ending mass incarceration of women. But quite frankly, there is such vast room for improvement in so many areas that we can wait for data collections to catch up while we take common sense action today.
Thank you. Ms. Onwuka? Microphone.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Bass. Thank you, Ranking Member Ratcliffe. I work with the Independent Women's Forum, and we're an educational organization committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. We advance policies that enhance people's freedoms and choices and opportunities. And so my focus specifically, my work, focuses on expanding opportunity for women. This subject is something that's really important to us. So this is truly a great time of opportunity for women. We know that we have record low unemployment rates. Over 1,800 new businesses were started by women each day from 2017 to 2018. Firms owned by Black or women of color have triple-digit growth over the past decade. Yet, a criminal background locks too many women out of opportunity and economic mobility. Work is a critical component to the successful transition from the criminal justice system back into society. So I'm encouraged by the historic bipartisan First Step Act that was passed and signed into law last year. It laid a foundation, but we know there's more to do for women. Conversations like today remind us that the left and the right are committed to helping every American achieve their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Organizations across the philosophical spectrum are engaged in criminal justice efforts, and for different reasons. And I think we can all agree that committing a crime and paying her debt to society should not preclude a woman from the pursuit of a better future. It's not just her future, but the future of her children, her family, her community that depend on her successful transition back into society. And it all starts with so many women who are in the criminal justice system. You've heard the statistics, they're staggering. But what's interesting is that we saw the replacement of judicial discretion with one-size-fits-all sentencing mandates, landing a lot of low-level nonviolent offenders in federal prisons for longer periods of time than otherwise they might have been given, and particularly because there are alternatives to serving time. Now that not only impacted women, but their families. And as a result, you have more women are likely to have served as a primary caregiver to children prior to entering prison and have plans to return upon release. We know that children whose parents are involved in the justice system, they face a host of challenges and difficulties. Incarceration also forces families deeper into poverty and debt. The burden falls on family members, society, and yes, us taxpayers. The family bond, especially with their children, often become the motivating factor for women not to return to crime. So effective criminal justice requires respect for the dignity of all people and the successful means towards rehabilitation. Now, while serving time, women face special challenges. Some of the panelists have talked about this, from general health and wellness to ongoing gynecological care and prenatal care if they're pregnant. They require separate facilities for showering and using the toilet. Serving a criminal sentence, though, should not mean that female inmates serve in dehumanizing, unsanitary, unsafe, or unhealthy conditions. Some level of privacy from male guards is a reasonable expectation and can protect female prisoners, many of whom have experienced sexual violence. Incarcerated pregnant women are the most vulnerable. Unfortunately, the justice system really considers the special needs of this population. Thankfully, the shackling of women is a practice that has been ended by law because of the risk it poses to moms and babies. And now, as a mother of a 7-month-old baby boy, this is especially close to my heart. Ongoing physical and mental health care should not be forgotten. And when it's time for a woman to to be released from prison, that is not the moment to begin thinking about what she's going to do afterwards. We know that women's recidivism rates are similarly troubling to those of men. About 1/4 of women released from prison have an arrest for a new crime within 6 months, 1/3 within a year, and 2/3 5 years out. So training, technical educational opportunities, including those tied to the faith community, can be assets in the rehabilitation and reentry process. There's evidence these programs work. The First Step Act encouraged rehabilitation programs and offers significant incentives to inmates to participate in recidivism reduction programs. And a strong economy is an ally in providing women opportunities, but where government puts up roadblocks to opportunity, government needs to remove them. We've seen that occupational licenses have been a tremendous hindrance for women who simply want to work. That's a place where we can start, and we're seeing states take some action there. The criminal justice system is an area where we all believe that smart reforms can help women who want to be productive members of society. So I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your testimony today, and we'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Schenk, I did not understand why you were indicted. You said that you were indicted, it sounded like years after your partner who abused you passed away. You were originally arrested. Could you please go through the sequence again and explain why you were indicted?
Absolutely. It tends to be a little confusing sometimes. The person that I was dating was murdered, like I had mentioned, in 2002. I was initially charged with conspiracy in 2002. I received a letter from my attorney 3 months after the initial charge stating that my case had been dismissed.
And your conspiracy was?
Drug-related conspiracy for a drug crime.
So you conspired to sell the drugs, even though you were locked in the house against your will?
I lived in the home.
Okay, go ahead.
So, and not only, so then I, like I said, I'd moved on with my life, and I had gotten married, had children, and then in 2007, they knocked on my door and with an indictment and charged me with conspiracy. But not only did I get conspiracy, but I also received 4 felonies. I was charged with the possession with intent to distribute cocaine, crack, and marijuana, along with the conspiracy charges, and a 2-point gun enhancement, based on the fact that I lived in the home.
So you were indicted 5 years after the drug dealer died?
Yes.
And 5 years after you were originally
Correct.
arrested? Okay. After you, that's crazy, but after you were released, I wanted to know what happened with your children. Who took care of your children while you were incarcerated?
Their father.
Their father took care of their children. And after you got out, did you get custody of your children?
Absolutely. 3 weeks after I got out, I went down with their dad, and I have joint custody of my daughters now. He's a wonderful man, a wonderful father. He's never kept the children from me. I was very helpful in keeping my relationship
How
with
much
them.
time did you serve?
9 years.
So how old are your children today?
Autumn is 15, Ava is 13, and Annalise is 11.
So from what years to when when you went in, they were how old?
4, 2, and 6 weeks old.
When you were released, they were how old?
13, 11, and 9.
And were you able to stay in touch with them? Didn't you say for a while you were close to them, but then you were transferred away?
Yes, initially I was in Pekin, Illinois, and I was able to see them in my first 3 years for about every 6 weeks, so I was able to maintain some type of connection with them, being so small. But the prison had closed for women, and I was transferred with 40 other women to Coleman, Florida.
Did anybody take into consideration the fact that you would not be able to be in touch with your family if you moved?
There was no consideration for anybody. There was 240 women that were scattered all across the country, and Pekin was the closest prison for all the women there. So women ended up in California, Texas, Florida.
One thing that is said, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
That's fine.
I'm concerned about my time, but one thing that is said about women that are incarcerated different than men is that women don't receive visits women visit men in prison, men don't visit women in prison. And I wanted to know from Ms. Shank and Ms. Kerman, was that your experience? Is that what you saw when you were in prison, or is that not accurate?
Absolutely. I mean, women would, you would get visits, and they would be very sparse as far as people there visiting their families. You get a lot of grandmothers bringing kids, caregivers.
How often did you see women whose children were in foster care while they were?
Often. I mean, I would talk to a lot of the women. I was there for 9 years, so I spoke with many women over the years that would lose their children to custody of their children.
Would parental rights be terminated
Parental
because
rights
they
would
were
be terminated.
incarcerated too long?
Yes,
Ms.
absolutely.
Kerman, what was your experience in seeing? Did you see women receive visits? Did you know women who lost their children? Did you know women whose children were in foster care?
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass. I feel that the relationship between mothers and children is the single most important factor of incarceration of women. I was not a mother when I was incarcerated. I am now. I think about that all the time. I thought about it all the time when I was locked up. I was very, very lucky. I was serving time in Connecticut, and I was a resident of New York City, so for many people, it was easy to visit me. Since then, the facility in Danbury has been repurposed, and a huge percentage of women who were incarcerated there have also been transferred far away from their families. What would happen is that you would see women, my bunkmate never received a visit the entire time we bunked together. She had 2 children, but then there were certain families that were fortunate enough to be able to be up in the visiting room with some frequency.
I'm going to run out of time, but I just wondered if anybody could comment on women that they saw who became pregnant while they were incarcerated.
There was a woman in Florida who became pregnant by an officer while I was incarcerated, and that is something that doesn't get talked about often enough, about the safety of women with officers who are there.
Thank you. Mr. Radcliffe?
Thank the Chair. Ms. Onwuka, you highlighted in your testimony the importance of dignity for women in prison, and I agree with you. This certainly should not be a partisan issue. We should all be willing to address, in a spirit of bipartisanship, I think we can, the needs of women and girls in the criminal justice system. Some of those issues, as you pointed out, were addressed in the First Step Act, which President Trump signed into law late last year. But you mentioned also that there are still areas for more to be done at the federal level to provide dignity for women inmates. So can you elaborate on those additional areas for improvement? And specifically, I'm interested whether you know any states that have taken action in those specific areas. And then if time's permitting, I'd like to get the perspective of Ms. Shank and Ms. Kerman, given your experiences.
Thank you. So actually, the comments of Ms. Cynthia Shank just now touches on one of those, the male prison guards area. I mentioned that it's, I think, reasonable for women to have some expectation of privacy, particularly when they're changing, they're undressing, they're showering, and we know that female prisoners are vulnerable, and a lot of them have unfortunately experienced sexual violence in the past. So when you have a situation where perhaps a male correctional officer enters into a female cell and she's changing, she may protest, say, may I have some privacy, and a verbal altercation could ensue. This could be triggering for that woman behind bars, and it could lead to a place that she doesn't want to go, and you don't want to have her being. So, I think the American, there are a couple of conservative organizations and progressive organizations that have come together to talk about why during incarceration it's reasonable that male guards shouldn't be present when a woman is strip searched. They should be, they shouldn't be supervising women who are in showers and other sensitive areas. Even the idea of forced and inappropriate inspections, these things are, I think, counterproductive to rehabilitating a woman behind bars. So I think there's an area there for understanding, what happens when male guards are present, what are potential guidelines or guardrails that should be put in place between men and women in sensitive areas. We understand that there are other places where it makes sense to have that happen. Another area that I think is concerning for pregnant women, we did talk about the shackling of women being ended, but I think the continued care for women who've had a baby afterwards is really important. Some recent research has found that correctional facilities tend to fail to provide physician-recommended standards of care for pregnant women, and that places women at the women's health and the health of the child at risk, even after a woman has had a baby. I know very many women who have had children understand that there is an emotional toll that's taken. And so, when you're denied medical care or you don't have adequate medical care, even mental health care that may be needed postpartum, I think those are areas where you both need some guidance from, obstetricians and gynecological experts on, what kind of care is actually needed and how federal prisons can provide that. And then in terms of states, I'd have to do a deeper dive. I do know states like Louisiana, a lot of conservative states have actually been implementing some of these at the state level. Texas is another great place that has implemented some changes in terms of federal prisons. And so happy to provide maybe some additional research at another time.
Thank you. Ms. Shank and Ms. Kerman, anything you want to add to that? Any perspective that you want to provide on those issues of dignity for women, areas that we could focus on here?
Absolutely. The guard to female situation is something that I don't speak about often, primarily because my children are usually in the room when I go and speak. But it is very prevalent, the guard and inmate relationships that happen in prisons. And I never felt safe changing. Guards know your routines. They know, and if they want to single you out, they will. And it is very common for an officer, to single somebody out. You would
Witness
know.
Shield for a minute. When you say guard to prisoner relationships, are these consensual or are you describing rape?
Well, when you put into perspective of somebody who is over you, who is in charge of you, they are consensual to the extent where, yes, the inmates are there, but they're also vulnerable. These are women who are, these are their caregivers. These are people that are over them. They are authority over them. So while they are consensual relationships that I'm aware of, to me, there's a level of not being consensual.
Power.
Power, absolutely. And they wield that power. I never had a relationship with an officer, but I can tell you that officers would know when I would shower, and they would walk by my room. They would enter my room when I was getting dressed frequently. It happened at every prison that I was at. I was at 3 different places, and this is just my story. I mean, you could talk to any one of those women, and they will all tell you it was very common to know that this officer was in a relationship with that inmate, or, it was just something that happened all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Nadler?
Thank you. Ms. Kerman, in your time in custody, you observed other women who were pregnant, I assume. Did you observe women who were pregnant and gave birth while incarcerated? And can you describe what you observed?
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I'll never forget the first day in prison for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that I remember so clearly after being processed in by correctional officers and transformed into 111-87424, it was February. I was being escorted up to the unit where I would live, to the building that would house me, and there were a group of women standing outside the building, and there was a woman who was very visibly pregnant. I learned that she was 8 months pregnant. And I remember just being so confused when I saw her. I was literally like, this must be a mistake. It had never occurred to me that there would be pregnant women in prison. And I am still deeply confused by that. I'm deeply troubled by the fact that so many women enter prison, and of course they've gone through an entire judicial process prior to incarceration, and that our choice as a society is to force them to go through their pregnancy and childbirth while under custody in a setting, as Ms. Onwuka has pointed out, that is not appropriate for pregnant people. That particular young woman that I saw went into labor shortly thereafter. Just a few weeks later, she went into labor. She was the first person I had ever seen in labor. She labored for about 12 hours there in the prison, occasionally checked on by staff, but largely assisted by the other women.
In a hospital unit?
Finally, after about 12 hours, they took her out to the local hospital, which is where she gave birth, and she was then immediately returned to the prison postpartum. in recovery from having given birth, but also incredibly drawn, sad, devastated because she'd been separated from her infant. And all of the biology that we know tells us that babies and mothers need to be together for months, for years, really. But certainly, that young lady who was serving an 18-month sentence for a low-level drug offense could have stayed in the community to give birth. She was from rural Maine, and it was very lucky that her family was able to take the baby, and it was very lucky that they were occasionally able to make the 8-hour drive down for her to see the baby. It was also very lucky that she was going home soon, because not everyone is that fortunate. It's the most important thing from my point of view that we think about pregnancy, reproductive rights and freedom, and motherhood when we think about women in the criminal justice system.
Let me ask that the video clip from Orange is the New Black, which
Sure.
portrays this heart-wrenching moment, be played
Let me
now
quickly
and then.
explain that this depicts the return of a prisoner immediately after giving birth.